All right. We are live to the best of my knowledge. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Common Ground. Glad to be with you. And yeah, hoping to have a better experience than we had last week. We had a challenge with our technology. It just says Eric Rodriguez. Okay. So let me go make sure that I am all good and all set here. We are live on Facebook. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes before we kick it off. And then I will bring on our guest and get started. Hope you guys are having a good week. All right. We are live to the best if we kick it off. Oops. And then I will bring on our guest. All right, cool. Hey, AJ, good to have you. Thanks for being on today, my friend. I'm going to give everybody a minute or two to hop on. I'm John Lombardo. This is Common Ground. I'm delighted to be with you live tonight for an exciting show. Happy Juneteenth. Very exciting show tonight. We have an old friend of mine and an amazing guest tonight with us, but I won't spoil it yet. I'll tell you about that fellow once I get things rolling. I'm going to give it another minute or two as we got people hopping on. I'm excited to have you all here with us tonight. Excited about tonight's show. Glad to be back. Last week was tough. All right. Welcome, everybody. Hi, Carol. Welcome to the show. Right on. Cool. Good to have you guys here. Thank you for being here tonight. We're going to kick it off in just a moment. Bring on my co-host Eric and Ron Baird, who's our guest tonight. Some of you guys know Ron. It's interesting because Ron is in Australia tonight to be with us, but he's also an old Ventura cat. And we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. It's 2 minutes after. We got people still popping on. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here. Thanks for being here. Right on. Hi, Clara. Glad you're here. All right. Well, let's get it started. I know that we've got a few more people joining, but let's get rolling. Let's kick it off as we always do. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. You are on Common Ground, the place where we bring our fear to let it die. Fear is the great divider. We see that today more than ever. And as I say this, fear and bigotry threaten to tear our nation apart. On this show, we seek to strike a blow against that fear by discussing the most difficult topics with respect, civility, and a mind opened to a differing opinion. Simply put, our goal is not to win the argument, but to model the lost art of civil disagreement. And I'm happy to tell you that we've found over and over again that when we can discuss our opinions freely, we can form an alliance of reason with our fellow citizens, even when we may not agree. We discover that we are not all that different, and it's not so hard to reach common ground. I'm your host, John Lombardo. Excited to be back with you guys tonight. And our topic for tonight's discussion is, how does the international community view the U.S. and its current struggles with racial inequality? The wave of protests that continue to sweep across the United States in the last 3 weeks over the brutal murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others at the hands of police have not stopped at our shores. As we struggle with the deep inequities within our society that affect people of color, the global community has joined the fray. And it turns out the USA isn't the only place where minority groups feel marginalized. Tonight we'll discuss how the international community views the USA's struggle with racial inequality and what's going on with their own. And maybe, just maybe, we can do something about it if we don't all kill each other first. All right, so right now I'm going to bring on my co-host. I always describe him as the smartest guy I know who still hangs out with me. So, hello, Eric. Welcome.
Well, hello, John.
Hello there.
Thank you, sir.
So good to have you. Glad to be back. Last week was rough. It was, but the technology beast won. But I'm glad to be back tonight. Glad to have you here. And so before we bring on our guest tonight, I kind of set it up talking about how our challenges right now with racial inequality in the United States of America are being the the movement has been observed and even picked up around the world. So talking about that, what are your thoughts about that? What have you seen this week? Like in your readings and your news and people you've talked to, what do you see going on out there?
Well, there's a couple things I think about. You and I 2 weeks ago said, "Hey, this seems different, doesn't it?" I mean, we both really felt like something different was happening, and there's plenty of evidence for that. We we see that protests have continued. In fact, just down the street from my apartment where I'm sitting now, there's a Black Lives Matter um, demonstration going on, and the these things have continued day after day after day, and not only in American cities, but as you said, cities all over the world. And I'm hoping to get to hear about what happened in Australia with Ron in a minute. But that's not the only difference. I see corporation after corporation after corporation putting out statements about they want to be transparent about looking at where they might be where they might have unequal opportunities, and some pretty impressive statements where people are corporations are revealing demographics and where they're falling short, admitting they're falling short, and describing how they're going to do better. There are just countless examples of the things that we're examining, from cities to looking at their police budgets to just a whole bunch of things. We are finally starting a conversation that for some reason we haven't been able to have at this scale, and it's quite exciting. And and there's a lot of people that would love to put the brakes on as well.
Yeah. Yeah, but no, I agree with you. And like we said, we talked about how this feels different, and I really hope it is, because one thing that one of the reasons I want to have these dialogues, these discussions, obviously this is what's going on in the world, and I want to be part of it. I know you do too, but I don't want to be back here again as a country. I I I really would like us to live in the land of the free. I would really like us to live in a place where everybody feels, you know, to within reason. There are always going to be people who feel like they didn't get a fair shake in life, but that should never be something that becomes institutionalized because of your race. Um,
It certainly has, and we touched 2 weeks ago about Colin Kaepernick kneeling, and about the fact that he was asking for the thing that the Constitution, he was doing his duty as a citizen of the country by calling attention to something that's in the Constitution that hasn't been realized yet. And racism is systematic. We hopefully will talk a lot about that tonight and next week, and for a long time to come. There is no question that there are systems in place, there are institutions that have, for the entire length of our country and still are today, unfair for people of color, and even more unfair if you're black.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Common Ground is an interactive show. If you haven't seen it before, please type in your comments. I keep an eye on the comments. If you have questions, I will try to get to them. I certainly read all the comments. You are free to disagree with myself or with Eric or anybody, and we love to hear differing opinions so long as they're rendered respectfully. And I'm gonna. You talked about Kaepernick and his protests, and the way that was received. And I want to talk about our president. I talk about this all the time. I believe that he's a dangerous human being. And this week, in fact, today, he tweeted out that he lumped in protesters with anarchists, lowlifes, agitators, and said, if you show up in Oklahoma, please understand you will not be treated the same way you were treated in Seattle, New York, and Minneapolis. It will be very different, which is a thinly veiled threat against them. And I don't think he understands that we have a constitutional right to protest. And in fact, we have a responsibility as Americans to protest when we think something's unjust. Now, you don't have to agree with the protest. You have the right to tell people that you disagree with them. But we should all be concerned about a statement like that. We should all be willing to defend one another's rights to express our opinions, so long as it is done so in a peaceful fashion. I don't know. Maybe our president wants to show them what he did, give them the same treatment they got in D.C. and gas them. I don't know, but I just think it's a dangerous precedent. Once again, I keep saying this guy's a dangerous narcissist. He keeps proving me right. You know. So yeah. By the way,
in fact, one of the things that I've been encouraged with demonstrations continuing is that it shows that, you know, as we always say, there's very biased news on both sides, and it's hard to always get the truth. But what is absolutely true are there have been hundreds of thousands of people over the past few weeks that have demonstrated worldwide peacefully. And in this country, we have the First Amendment, and I think it's first for a reason. We have the right to disagree with the government, and we have a responsibility to point out the things that the state is doing that are unfair. And in fact, I can't imagine why anybody would support police sweeping people from demonstrating. You stand out there and protect the rights of those protesters is what I think. That if you're demonstrating, you're exercising your First Amendment rights. Now, if somebody jumps on a car or breaks a window, that person should be arrested. The rest of the people should be their rights should be being protected. There should never be, or walk up to them and write them a jaywalking ticket if they're in the middle of the street and are not supposed to be. There is no cause. It just shines the light on how much reform we have to do with police, that there have been so many instances of beating people that are just standing there demonstrating and exercising their First Amendment rights.
It's insane. I would not have believed that. I would not have believed it were true, but I watched 20 videos. These are videos. They're not something that, you know, they're not doctored up. They're people shooting videos on the street. I've watched 20 videos that have been just shocking to me. It's heartbreaking, man. It's really, it tears the guts out of you to see it. And by the way, please, somebody out there, prove me wrong with some good data. I have scoured the headlines today and the news and anything I can find. I have not been able to find anything about a violent protest going on in the last few days. And like Eric said, once you break the law, once you break a window, once you steal stuff, you're not a protester anymore. You're a criminal, and you deserve to get, you know, arrested, of course. But if the protests are peaceful, as you said, Eric, I agree, they should be protected. Before we bring Ron on, and I want to respond. Zach Knutson, Zach, if you're still out there, Zach said, which laws do you think are the most racist? So Zach, there's a few things. This is a nuanced conversation, but I will tell you something that I was able to find this week. It's a study done on 700 cases in Northern California that happened between 2016 and 2019. 700 cases where 75% of the time the jurors that were stricken from the jury were either black, mostly black, or Hispanic, whereas Caucasian jurors were stricken from the jury 0.5%. This stacks juries against people of color. This is data. It's not a law, but it is a behavior that's been, you know, proven out by the data. So those are the kind of things I think we need to be aware of if we're going to create a more, you know, just a more fair society, in my opinion. But of course, your guys' opinions matter here too. But right before we go any further, guys, I want to bring on our guest tonight. I'm really excited to have him here. He has extensive experience teaching undergraduate criminology and sociology at University of Melbourne, and more importantly, he spoke at the Black Lives Matter rally a couple weeks back in Melbourne on behalf of the Indigenous people of Australia, and his comments were highlighted or were featured in the New York Times. So I'm really excited to have him with us tonight. He's also an old friend of mine. So Ron Baird, he's a PhD, but he also grew up in our neck of the woods, and we used to be in punk rock bands together, right, Ron? Welcome, man. Glad to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me on, John.
Right on. Well, Ron, I'm gonna throw some things at you so we can have a conversation. And of course, we're fielding some questions from the audience the whole time. So I'm
Cool.
kind of doing that dance back and forth all the time. But
Yeah,
um,
like, yep.
tell us a little bit about you. Like, just tell us about a little bit about your background growing up in the United States, how you came to be doing what you're doing in Australia. Give us the Reader's Digest version of that.
Okay, Reader's Digest version. If anybody knows anything about me, I'm pretty verbose, so I'll try and condense it.
Me
But
too.
as you probably introduced me, grew up in the United States, born and raised in Southern California, born in San Bernardino. My father was in the Air Force, got out of the Air Force, moved to Port Hueneme. Grew up there. It was kind of interesting. I mean, I'm mixed race. I'm African American and German American. But growing up, it's kind of a funny thing. I used to say, we were just kind of raised neutral. My parents didn't emphasize race, although I used to wonder why sometimes Dad would get really pissed off and start chasing somebody when we were out, and it was usually someone said, "Hey, look at the N word with the white woman or something," and so. Yeah, it was kind of funny growing up. But I mean, I'll say when I was introduced to race, I was in primary school, and we were playing in the playground, and somebody said, "Hey, what are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm a person." And it's like, "No, no, what are you?" And American, what are you? And I said, "Well, I'm black, and my dad's black, my mom's white." And it was like, "Oh, you're black and white television." And that kind of name stuck in primary school. Anyways, long story short, grew up there, went to school there, got involved in punk rock. That was like a critical, pivotal moment for me. It kind of changed. Well, it was either going to be the military or punk rock. I mean, it was.
You
I was involved in these military cadets as a young person, and was all bent on joining the Marines, and that didn't happen, and punk rock happened. And through punk rock, I guess that's where I developed a political consciousness.
So
Started questioning things, and and wrote about that in some form in my lyrics, probably pretty rudimentary as I was like 15, 16, 17, 18.
Well, Ron,
Yeah.
Ron was in a punk rock band called Stalag 13, very famous band around here.
Yeah.
I was in a far less famous band. But Ron, I'm going to read you a lyric that I didn't even have to look this up. I remember this
Yeah.
from a song that you wrote called Black Sticks, Silver Badge. Remember this song?
Yeah. 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 Totally. Yeah.
You enforce your rules on me, beat it in my head. You impose
Yeah.
your rules on me, beat them into my head. With your black sticks, silver badge, we're all going to be dead because someone gave you the authority to beat it into my head. That was 30 years ago, man, or 35 years
Yeah.
ago. What inspired you then to write that song?
That was born out of experience. It's I mean, again, probably something I didn't quantify then. I mean, I felt I was routinely harassed by Port Hueneme police, particularly Oxnard police, routinely pulled over and questioned, searched. I mean, one stage, I don't know. I think you rode around in my old '57 Chevy. Um, I had there was like a stomped in the dust Coors beer can that was like under the seat. It'd probably been there for a year or something because I never cleaned my car, and and the police were trying to give me a DUI based on that. And it was just this constant harassment. And then also being in the punk scene, man, I saw that many riots
Sure.
and police abuse. I mean, particularly there was a famous riot I think it was might have been Mindiola's ballroom or Finder's bar. It was this one major riot where they I think it was DOA maybe playing, and the police came to shut it down, but it was kind of like it was pre-planned. There was something like 500 police there, and they shut it down, pushed everyone out. And what I witnessed was the police breaking windows, the police antagonizing the people, the police beating people. And that was really what became the motivation for that song, was these series of abuses of punk rockers. And these punk rock in Southern California, let's face it, it was mixed race. This was they were beating on white kids, they're
Yeah.
beating on black kids, they're beating on any kid, and this just sheer brutality against I'm going, hey, if it's just a minor difference of musical taste and how I choose to dress, geez, this is hardcore. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, my brother got beat up by the cops a couple times, and he's a white kid. I think that we, the punk rock scene, it's an interesting microcosm to have this discussion around because it was seen as a threat to the establishment. It was seen as an
Yeah.
active form of rebellion, and I think how do we find the line? I mean, look, I hope that we can start to legislate things differently, design things differently, so that our police officers are actually more supported. I think a lot of the
Hmm.
crap that police do is because they are overstressed, overworked, and
Yeah.
being asked to do a tremendous amount of work they shouldn't be asked to do. Well, is that something that happens at a legislative point, or is it something we look for in the hiring process, psychology evaluations? What do you think?
Look, there's a whole range of issues here. I mean, yeah, part of it is the hiring process, but it's kind of becomes a chicken and the egg thing because look, I am not in any way, shape, or form anti-police.
Yeah,
There's sometimes, look, I have probably a healthy distrust of the police. I worry sometimes about the police, but I'm not anti-police. And what I think needs to happen is, as you say, it's probably a range of issues. I mean, a lot of it needs to start with, yeah, some of it's hiring practices, but that becomes problematized in particular ways with regards to, I mean, if anybody's ever been involved in hiring, it's difficult to make judgments in hiring, but
sure.
probably being better supported, being better funded, being better trained, and being, called out to deal with, things like mental health issues. That's where often many of these, deaths in custody or police shootings occur, is when the police are responding to what is largely a mental health issue.
Yeah.
So this is where something like, justice reinvestment strategies, this notion, I know you're right across it, of defunding the police. It's not saying take, money from the police and shut down the police. It's kind of mitigating and I guess shifting some of the strategies and approaches in reinvesting that money in a holistic community approach. I
Carol Selby. Carol
Yeah.
Selby, one of our viewers, has an interesting comment. She said, "Ever read Robinson Crusoe? Why didn't we question why a white guy ending up on an island with an islander is automatically the boss? It is taught."
Yeah, 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 yeah. And so, I mean, coming back, I mean, yeah, it is taught coming back to, starting young too, with education. And that's on both sides of, of the, the line of justice. So for, people who, may be criminals, or for the police, it's about, because a lot of how people get criminalized is through this notion of net widening and just general contact, coming in contact with the police, being questioned, being, I guess some education in, giving warnings, giving cautions to young people, particularly. These are some of the things that can kind of mitigate these problems from escalating. So it's, it is, I mean, I think definitely, John, it is about a combination of education and, and funding, and putting the funding where it's needed, and taking, I'm a big advocate of community policing. So this is, a notion, I mean, think back to the old days when the cop walked the beat, or I'm remember with Hueneme police particularly, there was an officer named it was Ferdinand something, but we called him Fernie, and I knew him from school. He used to bring, they would do the thing, they would bring the police car to school, and you'd kind of have a chat, and you got to sit in and turn on the siren. But that sort of engagement, that gave me I guess a healthy respect for the police. But then what I saw transpiring growing up was, well, sometimes the police abuse their power. So this idea of connecting with young people, and and creating programs that focus on, developing a mutual respect, a mutual rapport, and some sort of interaction, are probably something worth looking at.
Hey, Ron.
Yeah.
Um, we're not so familiar. I mean, I have some background and understand community policing. It's not something that's widely known about here. In the UK
Yeah.
and Australia, it's working well to bring those things back. And one of the things that's been going on recently here is we've been talking about taking police out of schools, which, having armed police in schools, there are some real cons to that. And that community aspect that you're talking about also gets taken away. And that oftentimes we see some problems and we don't have a nuanced conversation about the pros and cons of any particular aspect. And this is going to be one of those things. Like, I worked in schools, high schools mainly, also in juvenile hall, and I know this issue, and there can be some real badge heavy people, but I also met officers that were just incredible ambassadors for their department, and they were doing that community policing. And finding the right kinds of people for that is an important task that isn't always taken seriously. But I also wanted to comment. I don't know if it was a completely different situation, but I remember clearly being at the Palladium, and it seemed as though the police were planning. They showed up in riot gear, and they instigated something, and they were beating people that were running away, and they were breaking windows, and that wasn't my only experience. Just like you, in the in Wainimi and the beach in Ventura, we also got hassled, and you didn't have to be, I'm very pale, and being punk rock was enough. But I've never forgotten those experiences, and I've never forgotten. And when I started seeing these videos recently, and I've seen dozens and dozens, maybe 100 videos recently that reminded me of those early days when if you didn't do exactly what the police said, you were going to get beat.
And Eric, that's really important. That's what I believe I've witnessed in the past week here is just this sort of, and this has to come back to some kind of psychological training so that you understand that when things feel out of control to you, that is not a time to become physically violent toward people. I want to read a couple of comments that have popped up I apologize, everyone. I want you guys to know that the comments go through quickly, and I can't always...
I get it.
Yeah. Mark, okay, so Allison Mendez, I wanted to read Allison's comment because I know her husband is a police officer in Las Vegas. She said, basically, Allison, I can't read your statement anymore because it's gone, but she essentially said that they defunded the mental health programs there, so the police are being called to take care of those problems. It's the same thing here in Ventura, Allison. It started in the Reagan era. They started defunding mental health, and people were just literally being released on the streets. So it's a horrible thing for the police. Now, Mark Yale was on, and Mark said, isn't one of the root causes here gun culture? And I want to ask you about that, Ron, because you live in a place that doesn't have the same gun culture as the United States. So what do you think about that question?
Look, guns, they're a fundamental thing that need to be taken out of the equation. Now, I've said this before, and people jump in, well, like citizens, I'm sorry, we don't need guns. I live in a culture where owning a gun is just, it's not normal. It's not viewed as normal unless you're a hunter or live on a rural property. I've got a colleague I work with who lives on a rural property. He runs a farm as well and being an academic, and he needs it to take care of snakes and roos, but that's why he needs a gun. But gun culture here is fundamental. I don't know why our police here, we're still following that model of, heavily militarized police. Our Victoria police in the state I live in Victoria, in Australia, are very, they look like paramilitaries. They dress in black uniforms with, bloused boots with, tactical boots and all this gear. And, they've just rolled out their new automatic weapons. And, I don't know. We don't have a huge terrorist threat. We don't have these threats of this response. So it's it's a very interesting. Now I'm kind of rambling and lost my train of thought. But can I ask that you to repeat the question? But
yeah, it was just that. Is it how much of this has to do with gun culture? And
with gun culture, totally. Like I think the police are feel in the United States. If they're responding to something, in all likelihood somebody's got a gun. That's problematic. Problem number one. But you get caught up in this dichotomy of our rights and liberties, and you can't take away our firearms. And that's a conversation that needs to be had. but it's to me, it just seems impossible to get there, because every time there seems to be a school shooting, a mass shooting, it just, results in this clash of cultures and this clash of anger over, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and I'm not sure of a way forward, but it's definitely something I would, tend to suggest needs to be taken out of the equation, because we just don't have that here. And you don't, fear that, being shot, or, and that's something I actually fear when I return to the United States on visits is, I mean, you hear gunfire, you hear, routinely, murders of one,
we
two,
lead the
three
world in it.
people.
Yeah.
And you just don't hear about them. I mean, if 3 people were murdered in a day in Australia, it would be like, we'd be horrified. I mean, look, and I know we're dealing with the smaller population, but still, it's, I think that's a conversation that really, a real meaningful conversation about the soul of America with regards to guns is like, people, you don't need them.
It is, and it is so deeply entrenched in our economy, in our mentality, in our identity. That's a tough one. And we talked about that. You used the word. I wish that we could rephrase how we're talking about the ideas of restructuring, how policing is done, because we're using this terminology like, defund. Sounds like you want to get rid of the money that the police have. That just simply means redesigning how money is distributed to maybe actually expand the resources that support the police, at least in a positive sense, in a way that's constructive. And then demilitarization of the police. I was amazed. I did some homework this week. So in my little town where we don't have a huge crime problem, 35% of our annual budget is for the police. In Los Angeles, it's 50%. 50% of the city's budget is for police, and much of that is to arm the police. Now, but once again, going back to that gun culture, we generate and produce so much weaponry in this country that it falls into the hands of the people the police have to confront as well.
Yes, yeah.
So it's crazy. Carl's chiming in. I want to get some of the comments. Carl says a key component to the conversation is how inefficient police are. We have to start looking for other ways to solve our problems rather than calling the cops. We also have to discuss how cops are weaponized against people of color. And that's kind of so. Thank you for bringing that up, Carl. Ron, do you feel like? I'm just going to ask you this. It's a pretty point blank question. You are a person of color. When you're in the United States of America, do you feel as if you are targeted because of the color of your skin?
I have, yes.
Not all the time.
Yeah, depends. Not all the time. I mean, but yeah, I certainly have. Recently, probably not on visits recently, but I mean, look, growing up, I mean, I'll give you a quick short version of, I was, I mean, this is an interesting one, fitting the description. I fit the description of a suspect, apparently, in a string of crimes. This would have been about 1985. And I had visited a friend who had a boat. Actually, I used to work for him on this boat. We used to do charters for private schools and things. And it was kind of like an outdoor educator. Anyways, I visited this guy on a Saturday. He was African-American as well. And when I left, this was Ventura Marina. I was picked up, a cruiser picked me up behind me. And I noticed it. I immediately get nervous if there's a cruiser behind me. Long story short, by the time I was driving down Harbor Boulevard and turning left on, to head into Oxnard, there was 3 cruisers behind me, 2 up the road in front of me going to turn right behind me, and some coming down the street I was turning into. I turned, the lights went on, and I was surrounded by 10 cruisers, and they had their guns out. There was shotguns and 9mm pistols pointed at me, and it was occupant of green van, get out of the car. And I'm like, there was a range of instructions called to me, and I subsequently ended up on the side of the street with my hands on my head and told to walk backwards into the officer's arms. And now this is, it's Ventura, between Ventura and Oxnard. It's rough road. There's gravel. And all I'm thinking is if I trip, I'm dead. And, at one stage I turned to look and they're like, don't look, and lots of expletives. And when I was grabbed, I wasn't treated courteously. I was handcuffed so tight that I had marks on my wrist for 3 days. When they put me into the police car, they bashed my head onto the side. I don't know if this was intentional or they're just hyped up on, but this was because I fit the description of somebody of color. So that's, it's a dated example, but it is a real example of being, targeted for, who I looked like. And I mean, what amazed me was they searched my vehicle without my permission. They violated my rights. And then at the end of it all, they asked if I would mind coming down to the station to take a photograph of me so that we could have somebody to show, victims. And I was like, you've got to be kidding. You've got to be kidding, just to add insult to injury. And I actually told one of the officers, I probably used a few expletives back, and he got, all up in arms and was going to have a go at me, and his mate's like, leave him, let's go. Yeah. So that's an example of being targeted for, who I was. Yeah.
I have a question for you, sort of turning that around from Pete. One of our viewers said, Ron, when I was growing up, I was often the white victim of racism from blacks and gangs when I played basketball in the neighborhoods, and I was mugged on public transportation. Do you think that there's also a barrier to change from blacks toward whites as opposed to just whites versus blacks?
Well, look, that's an interesting one. Okay. I mean, look, it's a funny one. Like my wife's white, my wife's Italian background. Yeah. And in Australia, it's interesting because her family are first generation migrants. So her parents came, literally off the boat from Calabria. And they caused tremendous amounts of racism here, golf balls through the windows, scrawled, racist comments on their fin, the police called on them, etc. But I mean, it's funny in that, when we return to America, she's considered white, yet here she's a minority. It's kind of an odd construct. And I had an African-American woman tell me once that I was a race traitor because I married a white woman. And I was like, kind of incredulous that, why do we have to have this dichotomy? And so it's an interesting one because I mean, sometimes, my wife and I will have these discussions and she'll say, look, it is problematic that, often, some black people will be, hey, whites this, whites that, and so I guess I would say sometimes there are barriers to that. Sometimes there are barriers. I'm not going to sit here and say that, African-American people or any people of color. I mean, I guess people of color are angry, but sometimes we're maybe too angry. I mean, my dad used to say it really importantly. He said, rather than, pissing and moaning that, the oppressor has the boot on your neck. And sometimes that is the case. Stand up and do something about it. Get an education, and then, now, having gone to university and studied, I'm aware of wide range structural inequalities and barriers. And it's not simply that easy to get an education. And, there's a range of systemic biases and structural barriers that can, be down. So it is one of those things that I sometimes feel that people don't want to talk about.
You were educated in Australia. Do you think you could have gotten the same education as easily in United States of America?
Probably not. I mean, it's quite expensive. I mean, here I just missed the boat on free education. Tertiary education in Australia used to be 100% free. When I came here in late was it 88, 89, 89. And they were just bringing in something called HEC, which is the Higher Education Contribution Scheme. And I said, oh, look, but there was a lot of protests about that because for years, higher education had been free. And, so the bottom line, I guess, is what I'm saying is I think total for my undergraduate education, I paid 13,000 Australian dollars, which is considerably less than, so it was very cheap. So Australia's given me heaps, and no, I don't think I would have gotten that education. And I mean, look, my sister got she was educated at UCSB and, she did well. She was, very bright, extremely intelligent. I mean, I guess I was too, but I didn't really apply myself. I was too busy singing in punk rock bands. And, Yeah, no, I think it would have been much more difficult, much more costly, and probably a few more barriers had I, pursued education. I mean, look, when Australia, there was one stage I was going to come back, I was going to come home, and my dad was like, "No, you got more opportunity there." And a lot of what he was saying was, an angry person of color. Look, because I mean, I do have a temper. I do get really irate at injustices, and I can be vocal. He said, "You're better off there," and in many respects, he was right. So yeah, the short answer is no. I don't think I would have had the same opportunity. I mean, not the same opportunity. It would have just been a hell of a lot harder and a hell of a lot more expensive. And I mean, that's probably, something to think about. And look, we're doing our best here to roll that back. I mean, our current government, it's a liberal national party, which is, loosely equivalent to the Republicans, their conservative party. And so, I mean, they've just raised fees for an arts degree. So for a humanities, social sciences degree, they've just increased the fees on those by 113%. So it's, we're doing our best to kind of, curtail marginalized people or poor people from getting an education here. But yeah.
John and Ron, what if I might, one of the things that Pete talked about, I think one of the important parts of this overall conversation about race is, of course, there are all kinds of personal barriers, and there are experiences that we all have of being discriminated against in certain ways. But one of the things that we're talking about, on a bigger scale right now, are the ways in which racism is institutionalized in this country. And Ron, you touched on it a little bit, that's where Pete's question is a little bit different. Yeah, we've all had experiences. Ron, you don't know this, but I was adopted by a Mexican man. He's darker skinned than you, and I grew up with the last name Rodriguez, and I had my own identity issues and issues in different communities, but code switching and also you understand that. But I had the privilege of looking like this in this country, and still do, and there are we could talk about a lot of different ways. John mentioned in the open about some jury stacking in a certain way against people of color, and there are many ways, many economic, institutionalized systems that are biased against people of color. And so I think that's the important thing that Pete was, he was referring to personal experiences, but we're talking about stuff that the government supports or maybe even designs.
That's a barrier for people. It's a barrier. There's, I'll tell you something that I have seen. I see this clearly, that this actually goes deeper than race. And one of the reasons that you see so much support right now for Black Lives Matter and for this movement from all kinds of people. I've been I was at the protest downtown here, thousands of people. There are a lot of kids, all different colors down there, young people. It's because this really, a lot of the systemic isms is against the poor. The people of color tend to be in that demographic, but it's a lot of what's systemic is sort of is an economic type of suppression that keeps people from that barrier to entry. And so I want to ask you a question, Ron, because I got so many things I want to get to.
It's complex.
Where's the line? And I know I've got some other folks out there watching, some people of color watching. I know there's police watching. Where's the line of where a group of people, whether it's black people living in Alabama, or it's people that we used to call white trash, poor people living in trailer parks, whatever. I was raised that way, kind of. Where's the line of where it becomes you are actually a victim of this systemic racism and this systemic design that does not grant you access to these resources? And then, like your dad said, bootstraps, right? We had Kenneth Westbrooks was on the show a couple weeks ago. He said something great. He said some people don't have any boots. So,
Yeah.
we're talking about bootstraps. Where do you see that line? I want to ask you about that.
Okay, look, I mean, these are real, you raise really important points. And I mean, I guess the thing, and I mean, that you acknowledge, and I touched on a little bit talking about systemic, barriers, racial biases, things when I was talking about education. We're dealing with a broad gamut of problem here that go beyond race, that, inculcate, become racialized. But I mean, how I like to put it sometimes is that, we should almost couch these more as people problems rather than racial problems, or social problems rather than racialized problems. And I mean, you make the point, because this is an attack on the poor. This is an attack on the marginalized. This is, in that largely, Black, brown, and people of color occupy, often those, those lower echelons of society. And, it becomes so intertwined and complicated. And, in no way, shape, or form am I denying those. Those are what we need to address. But sometimes when they're just kind of locked into this dichotomous racial binary of us against them, Black versus white, becomes pride rather than, and it probably goes back to the founding of the United States, being founded on this inherent strident individualism and this neoliberalism and this conservative, my rights above all, rather than thinking collectively. I mean, it's one thing, living in a culture like Australia where, I mean, let's face it, I mean, in many respects, we're a social democracy. We're a welfare state. If you fall off the ladder, you can be supported. There's a safety net. There's welfare, there's job security. And I mean, look, and that's been attacked and trying to be eroded over the past years. I mean, I think it was Allison made the point in response to Allison's comment, John, you made the point that, this goes back to Reagan, this idea of, less resources to the police, having to respond to, mental health issues. I mean, the America I grew up in the America I see now are kind of two different things. Like, there wasn't the rampant homelessness. No, I'm not saying there wasn't homelessness, there wasn't poverty, but there wasn't this rampant homelessness. It was, a Reagan initiative that in '84, shut off federal funding to mental health institutions, that you saw the streets flooded with people with mental health issues. And that's, what we're dealing with. Now, it's sorry, this is a long-winded response, but it's a very complex question. So these systemic and structural biases, because sometimes it feels like they are inherently built into the system. I mean, I'll draw your attention to, a study by Bernhardt and Molinate in 2003 from the National Bureau of Economic Research, who, looking at racial bias in labor markets and hiring, this idea of are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? This is the title of their, and so this, this sort of type of racialization is, inherent in the system, because yes, what this study goes on to, their findings strongly suggest and point to that if you have an African American sounding name, you're most likely not going to get the job or even an interview, even though you may be more qualified than Emily or Greg. So it's these types of responses that need to be addressed and need to be acknowledged. And I often think back to that Minor Threat song, "Guilty of Being White."
Yeah.
It's an interesting one. I mean, no one's saying you should be guilty for being white, but saying you should acknowledge, privilege. You should acknowledge that. I mean, hey, look, the United States is a wealthy country, but hey, for, quite a long time, for hundreds of years, labor wasn't paid for. There was slavery. And I mean, that's a reality, and that's not that far. And I mean, that's something I said in my Black Lives Matter speech, is my great-grandfather was a slave. I mean, he was a slave for a short period of time, from the time he was born until 1865 at emancipation. But my family, my father felt the experiences of that ongoing racism. So these are things we need to address and need to acknowledge. That, we're built on a contradictory and, racist past. I mean, it's something I struggled with. One of my majors as an undergrad was U.S. history. And I wrote, a nice essay on the contradictions of the founding of the United States, that, we talk about freedom, equality, but, equally, it depends on who you're talking to, because if you're talking about a black man at the time, I would have been a slave. So it's those inherent contradictions in the political structure, the fabric of society, the education system that need to be addressed. It's extremely problematic and difficult, but we need to start acknowledging that and addressing that, this systemic, bias, this systemic issues, and not only of race, but of poverty. I mean, there needs to be, I mean, I was amazed, we were in Berkeley for 6 months. My wife was on sabbatical leave, and I was amazed. There was this huge protest about, cutting income tax. Oh, we shouldn't pay income tax. And I'm like, well, hell, we pay 33% here. We pay a lot of money, but we have free healthcare, or next to free healthcare. We have, there's so many social supports here. It's incredible in Australia. And that's, but we could even do better. We could be like Finland. We could be like, Denmark or other Scandinavian countries. Anyway, sorry, I'm carrying on.
No, it's okay, Ron. I want to ask you about that because it ties into what Marcia asked. Does Ron experience racism in Australia? And I want to roll her question into something you just said about, in your opinion, do those social safeguards and do those social safeguards that you have in Australia, do you think that those are a deterrent to the kind of strife we're seeing, to gun violence, racism, all those things, that people sort of feel protected and taken care of by their society? Do you think that produces that? And then I also want to answer Marcia's question, if you experience racism in Australia.
Yeah, look, in many respects, I do think those social safety nets do. I mean, the roots of a welfare state, particularly in the United Kingdom, some of it is, placating, the masses. We want to keep them happy. I mean, because you're gonna reduce people being, upset and angry and this mob rule, and that's some of the origins of it, from a kind of a conservative perspective in the UK, some of its history. But yes, what it does it, if you can afford to get healthcare without being burdened, having to take out a second mortgage if you've got one, it does, I guess, put you in a better mindset to go, okay, at least the government is trying to do something for us.
Yeah. Sure.
And, but like I said, equally, it's, I mean, those, a lot of what we've achieved in Australia, don't get me wrong, it's been attacked, it's being eroded, there has been changes to it. As I said, we've got the equivalent of a Republican government in the Morrison government here, so to some degree, I think social safeguards do make for a more happy and socially conscious populace. Now, the second question about experiencing racism, yeah, most certainly I've experienced racism. I mean, make no mistake, Australia is a very racist society. It's probably a little, again, my wife and I have discussions around this, and I mean, we discuss this, sometimes a little more subtle, sometimes, I mean, if you speak to an Anglo-Celtic Australian, they would say, oh, no, we're tolerant, we're not racist. But you see a lot of, it's kind of interesting. It's because we're a migrant society. There's lots of migrants here. So yeah, there is racism here for sure. Damn right, there's racism here, and a hell of a lot of it. I mean, remember up until about 1964, 65, we had the white Australia policy. We wanted to keep, people of color out. It was migration was, primarily from the United Kingdom, primarily from Northern Europe. Then when there were labor shortages, they went down to the Southern Europeans. But, that's hence where my wife's family came over here. But they opted, as I talked about, incredible amounts of racism. So, and how we treat our indigenous people is horrific. And that's what the rally was. It was the Black Lives Matter rally I attended here was, solidarity with George Floyd and the wider Black Lives Matter movement, but equally to support indigenous deaths in custody. So yeah, certainly I've encountered racism here. I've been called a boong and abo, the N-word, but less overtly. Sometimes when I meet people, they, they'll speak to me on the phone, we'll have a meeting, and then when they meet me in person, you see that little flicker in the eye of like, oh, like, how did he get here? He's black, so you experience those little micro things a lot. And yeah, it's kind of funny. Yeah, and I've been stopped and targeted by the police. What are you doing? Where are you doing? When they hear the American accent, they get a little bit, oh, we have to treat him a little differently, And so yeah, it's funny. It's really funny how and then often I've encountered a lot of like real subtle, just kind of like, I mean, I'll give you an example. When I first got here, when I first migrated here, I was always like, are you here to play basketball? Like, because basketball is taking off. And so because I'm African American and in Australia, I'm here to play basketball. And my response sometimes was, if I was in a jocular mood, was, yeah, and I like to eat watermelon and eat fried chicken too. It's all good.
Yeah. Well, you're getting a couple of comments. Carl says that he gets that microaggression all the time. And Samuel said he loved your speech, Ron. I want to get into, and by the way, guys, this is Common Ground. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to be back next week, and I just want to take a moment to announce next week we'll be back talking about this particular subject again. Our guest will be Carl Parrish. He's the founder of Represent Arizona and Voters Choice Arizona. He's a grassroots organizer for social justice, and today he's working on Campaign Zero to ensure community oversight with statewide police forces. So we're going to keep this conversation going next week, so please come back and join us next week. But we're not done by a long shot here. So let's get back to talking about the protests and what's going on with the police, because they're working, aren't they? I mean, it seems to me all of these I'm seeing. So I'm seeing a lot of pandering, which I think is useless. And I'm going to talk about that at the end of this. But it's the pandering. Let's forget about that. But I'm seeing. So let's talk about. I'm seeing charges being brought against people who committed crimes. We wouldn't have seen some of these cases go to trial if it weren't for these protests drawing attention to it. I believe it's Colorado. Colorado has just voted to end qualified immunity. The LA Council's introduced a motion to replace officers with unarmed law enforcement in nonviolent situations. I mean, people are actually looking at how it's structured, and it's absolutely a result of these sustained protests and the fact that they've been able to maintain. There was a lot of craziness and violence in the beginning, but like I said at the beginning, man, I have scoured the headlines and I can't find any news about violent protests. I found, unfortunately, plenty of news about violent responses to the protests. So it's working, isn't it?
Look, I would largely say yes. That I mean, it's interesting because then you hear some some positions in society arguing that, oh, we're just placating protesters, and it's like, no, you're responding to people's demands for justice. I mean, when the mobs take to the streets, it's not for nothing. It's to call for change. People have had enough. And I mean, the point you make is it's not just black people there. It's white people. It's everyone. My oldest daughter is a lawyer and lives in New York, and she's saying, look, the protests, the rallies, they are largely 100% peaceful. When, as you point out, John, it's the police response that's violent. There
was violence from protesters in the beginning, breaking.
Yeah, sure. In Minneapolis, stuff, yeah, for sure. And and again, it's like with and look, there's opportunists, there's looting, there's this and that, and it's like, and it's for not 1 second do I condone that behavior. But I mean, it was actually, I mean, I'll relate an interesting point that Robin G. Kelly, he's the I think it's the head of history at UCLA. He made an important point about looting. He said, look, I don't condone looting, but I can understand people's anger. I mean, and this is a point that Eric made earlier about the kind of systemic problem of how, like we can look at redlining, we can look at, predatory lending practices amongst, African-American communities and people of color generally. We can look at, all of this, and the point Kelly made was that African American people in particular, and people of color more generally, have been looted by the system for many years. So he can understand that anger, and that, this, it's kind of this, reappropriation from below, or, a redistribution of wealth from below. Now, that's just an explanation for it, and it's not condoning it. I'm not condoning it, but, thereas in some respects we can understand it, or,
I'm very vocal about, look, I said at the beginning, I want this to change the shape of how our society works so that it works better for all people. And I don't believe that will happen if we allow these protests to descend into violence. I believe one of the reasons we have so much support around the world, the way we've captured the hearts and minds of people, I've said this over and over again, is because the protests have been largely nonviolent, and that's when you're able to sustain the movement. If the movement descends into lawlessness and violence, it falls apart. Nobody wants to be part of it.
For sure. I mean, and that's what we saw out of that little stunt by President Trump of violently clearing these protesters from Lafayette Park to do his little jaunt across the park and stand holding the Bible. The protesters came back, but the protesters didn't respond. The protesters, kneeled. The protesters were peaceful. And what you saw after that event across America was, protests being even more calm. And I mean, I totally agree with and take your point on that, that we need to keep this focused on real change and just, expressing dissent by being in the street and questioning and calling out and calling for change. I 100% agree that we need to, that's the approach that needs to be taken.
I want to talk about a narrative that's out there, and I'm hoping that we can lay this narrative to rest. Talking to a friend of mine in a Facebook conversation last week on a post that I put out, and this is a very intelligent and decent human being who said this, but talked about, I'm all for Black Lives Matter. I'm not a racist. However, I feel like these Black Lives Matter people are telling me if I don't agree with everything that they say and do, I'm going to be threatened, but up, right? And then goes on to talk about how, yes, there's some bad police, but mostly the police are great people and doing good things. And there's police watching this show right now. And so this narrative I've noticed, and I've heard it a lot, it starts with the blanket statement, I'm not a racist, and he probably isn't in any active, but I've noticed that he is cherry picking the worst of the protesters and the best of the police. So we're looking at the good side of the police. They're mostly good. We're looking at the protesters and saying that there's all this hate and force. And I've been there. I know that is not the primary message on these protests. So how do we get people to look at this equitably and let go of some of those narratives that excuse? I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's a really good question, and I'm not really sure I have a solid response. I mean, because equally, sometimes on the side of protests, you can see people cherry picking the worst of the police and the best.
Sure.
You can see these dichotomies on both sides, and I don't know. It's an interesting one. I mean, I guess what I would point to is that ongoing systemic racial bias. I mean, the simple fact that, my parents, had to talk to me about how do you not get shot by the police? That simple reality demonstrates there's a problem. Is that, keep your hands on the wheel, always, and I mean, it's common sense, but I mean, equally, I've been seeing this narrative of, well, if you just do what the police tell you, this won't be a problem. And I'm like, well, I mean, again, I'll illustrate it with an example. In Los Angeles at the Whiskey A Go-Go, couldn't get in. A group of us walked to a park. We're just hanging out, talking, right? Waiting till the gig ended. I'm not sure if it was LAPD or LA County Sheriff's crews by, roused us, not very nicely. And I mean, effectively an hour about who lit the shoe on fire. We complied. We stood up. We didn't yell, but we were placed kneeling in front of a chain link fence. My face pressed against the chain link fence, leaving marks on my face. I had mace spread in my face while they were pressing my face into the chain link fence. A knee was applied to my back. It was painful. It hurt. So I was compliant and I did nothing wrong. And I don't know what the hell they were talking about, who lit the shoe on fire. And then funnily enough, after we kind of laughed about it, they finally let us go. We were walking back to the Whiskey A Go-Go, and there was, in a side street, there was some boot, a smoldering boot in the road. And so that, those sorts of arguments. But how do we get past this? Yeah.
Well, I want to stay on this a little bit, and because Carl said I would, and I think he's referring to what to the narrative I just referred to, and he said I would want to point out that the worst of one set is killing people, the worst of the other set is speaking against people. So I think he's saying that the Black Lives Matter people are speaking against people, whereas the worst of the police are killing people. Right?
Yeah,
Carl?
true. Yeah,
great point. And so I want to ask another question about another narrative that's out there. Carl, and please chime in on this too, but Ron, I want to ask you, one of the narratives I hear everywhere is, where are all these Black Lives Matter voices when black people are killing black people?
Okay, all right. This black on black crime thing, this just gets my goat and really kills
great.
me.
I want to hear what you have to say.
And look, the only time we hear about black on black crime is when usually white officers murder a black person. This is the only time there's concern for the black community and concern for black on black crime. Look, as a sociologist, as a criminologist, statistically, crime. Look, statistically, I'm just gonna, refer to some notes. Crime's often committed due to proximity. Yeah. So it's where you live, where you interact with. Okay. So, if we look at this notion of black on black crime, 90% of black murder victims are murdered by, the assailants is black, right? Yeah. Now, but equally, if we look, these are statistics from the United States, but equally, 83% of white murder victims, the assailant is white. So, what Leonard Pitts, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning African-American journalist from, he's just a journalist, it's regardless of his race, at the Miami Herald. And he said, a really nice quote. He said, there's another word for black on black crime, and it's simply crime. So it's something, that I'm really tired of hearing. And we need to address a crime problem. It's kind of like something I said earlier on, where I said a lot of the issues we're dealing with are people issues. We need to kind of step away from, looking at, these racialized dichotomies, although you can't ignore it because racism is real and it's there and entrenched. But, equally, it's about these attacks on all marginalized peoples and marginalized groups.
Well, Ron,
let me for a second. I just want to say it relates back to the question that you just read a minute ago, or the comment that you just read a minute ago. When people are murdered, when we're talking about gang violence or those are criminals. What we're talking about is very different. What we're talking about police. We're talking about a job that we're paying people to do. We are taking our tax dollar money and saying, keep us safe. And so it's just not.
It's apples to oranges. Absolutely. You're comparing the behavior of criminals with the behavior of the people that are supposed to be trained to stop crime. Yeah.
When we look at, like the murder of Eric Garner, that was just, all of these murders are ludicrous. These, George Floyd's murder was ludicrous. Whether, and I'm hearing this narrative of, he was a criminal. So a criminal deserves to be murdered in the street like a dog with no, have the police become judge, jury, and executioner. That's tyranny. What we need is, he needed to be apprehended. Again, comply. You didn't need to put I mean, watch that video far too many times.
Yeah.
And I don't know what you could say, but that man was murdered. Eric Garner was murdered. These people were murdered. And that, that's the important point is this. Yeah. I take that point that the crime, when we're talking about crime, we're talking about crime. We're talking about criminals. And it happens in any community, white community, Latino community. But what we're talking about is state power and state authority vested in an individual who can take your life. That's why I'm usually afraid when there's a police cruiser behind me, is because this person can take away my rights. This person can take away my life.
Eric, Eric, I'll turn it over to you for a second.
Well, one of the things that we were also talking about, systemic issues, and Ron, you gave an example, and we had also, there's the statistics about people of color being pulled over at greater rates, charged at greater rates of force being used. I mean, these are not made up things. We have statistics for these going back
evidence, yeah,
a long time. And people who are incarcerated, why is 38% of our incarcerated population Black people? I mean, there are systemic problems that we need to address. And one of the things that I think that John was sort of referring to in terms of placating is there's many, many good things going on, and people are having a conversation that we haven't had in a depth that we haven't had yet. And I appreciate it. And we got to keep moving forward because there are deeper issues that need, and much of it is economic. But I just wanted to throw out a couple of those things about the systemic racism, because it seems a lot of the comments that John has read are really about more personal experiences.
Yeah.
And I think I think that people don't see it. I really believe that if I don't want to get into talking about the light the match tropes that get people fired up, but if there is prevalent privilege, it is that we don't have to see that. People don't see that. People, I absolutely now understand, after talking to people of color for the last 4 weeks on this show and leading up to this show, I understand that I am granted and afforded a freedom that not everybody in this country gets, and that is that I'm not afraid my children are going to be shot by police. And that is not a freedom that everybody enjoys in this country, and that makes that makes me furious, man. It makes my stomach knot up.
I mean, look, that's the reason I told you. That's why my dad said, stay there, stay in Australia, don't come back to America. It was to protect me from that. Like I said, I'm a vocal, outspoken person, and when by police, more often than not to say, well, what am I being challenged for? Why are you, which is a legitimate question. I don't know why asking a question of authority becomes somehow problematic or somehow violent or somehow, you have rights, but, supposedly I was founded on was, a set of rights. And when you assert those rights, that shouldn't be you're being assaulted, arrested. And look, I mean, these systemic issues, I mean, I don't even know where to begin, really. I mean, in education, in, hiring practices, in, just, I mean, simple things like being followed around a shop or being, asked to check my bags. Why? Because I fit the profile. I mean, this comes back to this notion of racial profiling. And this is something, police need to address, urgently, is racial profiling, is, targeting people of color for, I mean, look, and I mean, we point to arrest statistics or people serving time, who are incarcerated. Oh, only criminals. I mean, look, there's plenty of people, of color in jail for the most, I mean, look, we can look at Khalif Browder, that story is, gut wrenching, where, he did not commit this crime. he was incarcerated in Rikers with, wanting a trial to clear his name, yet he is badgered and denied justice for years in a tactic that's, articulated by attorney generals across the country to, get a guilty plea. You want to get out of hell, plead guilty. But he was adamant, I didn't commit this crime, and subsequently took his own life because of the brutal treatment of our prison systems. The prison system has been, in many respects, this notion of mass incarceration is because people of color are targeted to infinitely greater degrees than white people or non people of color. So this is going to lead to greater interactions and greater numbers of incarcerations, and incarcerations for minor offenses, for possession of narcotics, for something that would normally be, you would be let off with a warning, becomes something that you're arrested for. And we can get into the looking at it theoretically from labeling theory to net widening to those constant contacts with the police as a young person, that subsequently you become enmeshed in the criminal justice system. And once you're enmeshed in the criminal justice system, it is terribly hard to get yourself out of its tentacles. It's hard to move on. It's hard to get a job. So this is something that we need to address, apart from the wider issues of just those variety of structural barriers and economic barriers that are prevalent in the United States.
I just keep coming back to, and listen, I certainly don't want, and one of our Rush said that's not accurate. Rush, can you please, that doesn't help me. I don't know what you're referring to. Please let me know what it is so we can respond to it. So much of this is economic. So I'll tell you, I read a story about, these famous actors whose children have been bribed into these big schools.
Yes. Yeah.
So there was a study done. I think it's in the Hamptons, up in this huge area up in the Hamptons, where something like 75% of the kids that lived up there were able to get notes from their doctors that relieved them from having a time limit on their SATs because of stress. The same thing that you are talking about with this gentleman who can't get out of jail without pleading guilty, and the incarceration of people of color, all of this is economic. It's the resources you have access to. We see it over and over again. All kinds of people. We see it all the time. If you can afford a defense, we call it, you do not have to obey the laws in the same way. I'll bring it back to this president we currently have. I just sat here and watched him ignore subpoenas from the highest law in the land. I can't do that. Why don't I have to? Why can't I say, you know what? That trial that case you have against me, I think it's bullshit, so I'm not going to show up for my court hearing. Why can't I do that? This is economic. It's socioeconomic. It falls to people of color, but it's not just people of color. I really believe it's the poor, and that is why we are seeing such widespread support for this movement, because the black people are leading the charge. It's a Black Lives Matter banner. It's a Black Lives Matter platform, but there's a bunch of people that are disenfranchised, regardless of their color, that feel like, yeah, this applies to me too.
Yeah, there's and look, there's a range of tropes that are employed to suggest, and again, this is something that is often pointed at about, oh, it's Black Lives Matter, this other trope of all lives matter. No one's saying all lives don't matter. It's saying that Black Lives Matter often matter less, or that why is it statistically that people of color are routinely victimized, or often end up dead in these altercations, or often end up incarcerated in these interactions with police. That that's the point. And I mean, the point you make, that it being economic, is, yeah, I would be looking for degrees of deep in degrees of change in how it's governed. And I'm so sick to death of hearing things like universal health care, it's communist, it's socialist, it's just common human decency. why should why should someone, I mean, I was reading an article, gentleman he survived COVID, but he's now got a $1.1 million hospital bill. How on earth is he going to pay that? He's not. I mean, it's, to me, to my mind, I mean, this is coming back to these notions of, government, really broadening out welfare and support for its citizens, all of its citizens, not just those who afford it. That to me is justice, is social justice. And we can create a society where people can afford adequate health care and dental care. And it's also an investment in society, because you're going to have less people sick. You're going to have less people, putting a drain on the system in those tax dollars. You're going to create an environment where people can become employable and employed. That reducing, I mean, something like tertiary education, higher education, that needs to be much more accessible, where we're not just educating an elite, but we're educating for all. That's, I mean, probably in a nutshell is where things come back to is education, to
Ron,
create some
you and
real and systemic change.
You and I have reached common ground on this point, because I really believe that is the foundational challenge. Look, the reason we had racism was economy. It was economic. We want free labor. The reason we had slavery, the reason that the reason for all of this is what I call there's a difference between responsible capitalism and a free market and corporate rampant capitalism. We live under a system of rampant corporate capitalism, and it is sucking the life out of our society. And so that you see, who can possibly think that it's mathematically a good idea to take things like housing, education, and healthcare and make it cost prohibitive to almost everybody? Who thinks that's a good idea? That's what we've done. We've seen these things increase and cost thousands of percentiles in my lifetime. And I'm going to tell you something. When you don't feel like you can get an education, when you don't feel like you can go to the doctor to take care of your family, when you don't feel like you can afford to live somewhere, you start to become desperate. And desperate people care a little bit less about your life and their own.
Yeah,
and I think that's where a lot of this comes from.
But it's the light side of that too is, I mean, the light side of that anger are these demonstrations. The reason why you have so many people joining in is because of those economic issues. I mean, it is clear in this country that we have a wealth division that is growing, and there are more and more of us who are having a hard time. The vast majority of Americans have no savings, and the pandemic has shown a light on that. It's going to be tough. There are tough economic times for us coming right now, and Ron was talking about access to certain things, and I was thinking, I too am not anti-police. My dad, who adopted me, whose name I have, was in the Ventura County Sheriff's. He was a cop for 35 years. I have family members who are right now who are in law enforcement, who I would love to even change that name. If while we're having this conversation, can we talk about public safety instead of law enforcement? A broader concept of what we're supposed to be doing. I don't want law enforcement, but the Ventura County Sheriffs, they don't need some of those military vehicles they have. But we do have a bunch of people in our county that need some health care. I mean, let's start putting it to a vote where some of this money that we're spending goes. Even if we're talking about, even if we can't get the 1% to participate, can we get some things? Can we have a little bit more power in terms of so that defund movement actually has real appeal to, I think, a lot of people, despite the fact that some are really upset about the language. We have to, and I know I'm getting a little long-winded, but let me say one thing about, I was involved with this planning commission of something called the Family Justice Center. The DA's office spearheaded that, and they had an incredible presentation about the human and fiscal savings by caring about preventing crime through social programs. And we got it here. The DA recognized, and got all of these cops and all these different agencies, 200 agencies, to join in, because it was the statistics were overwhelming in what we pay and the human cost, and by not addressing the issues of trauma, not addressing the social, the housing, all of those issues that we're talking about here, that's the way you prevent crime. And so that's where this discussion has to go in terms of reallocating some of the funds. 35 or 50% of a city's budget is to law enforcement is a misallocation of funds, and what happens is we continue to escalate the issues. We're not solving any of the problems.
This is, some of the points I was talking about earlier about justice reinvestment is we need to look at, exactly like the program you're talking about. Those are initiatives that are being, ingrained and embedded and brought to the fore in Australia. In Victoria, we have, something like called group conferencing. So this is run, and it's actually run by a variety. In Victoria, it's run by Jesuit Social Services in conjunction with the courts. I'm also currently working on a research project on an e-recovery app that's looking at so people charged with drug offenses and trying to deal with their addictions, utilizing this app to help them kind of engage. And so there's a number of community-oriented initiatives designed to keep people out of prisons, because that's another thing that we've kind of touched on, is that prisons are very problematic. If you want to increase crime, keep sending people to prison. They're brutal, horrible, deinstitutionalizing, dehumanizing places where people are violated, and they learn crime. I can tell you a dozen stories working in youth justice and working with young people who learn to be better criminals because they got caught up in that system. We need to look at scaling that back as well. But we need to look at prisons. That's a real movement here. And it's not to say that, look, some extremely violent offenders or, rapists need to be removed from society. That's not saying that there is a small place for penal incarceration, but that the vast majority of people who end up in prisons don't need to be there. A couple of programs I'll speak to is that group conferencing, where when you have young people caught up in, early criminality, this is a way for them to acknowledge, reflect. They're the victims there. A counselor's there, and it's taking a holistic community approach. Sometimes a member of the police will be there, and they sit down and discuss the act and the actions, and they move forward. Another program I'd like to touch on is Maranguka in New South Wales. Maranguka in New South Wales, large Indigenous population, a lot of problems and issues with their young people there. But what they've done through, a multi-pronged approach, working with police, working with community organizations, is creating much more use of cautions by police in diversion programs that seek to, not incarcerate. Incarceration should be the last port of call. And in many cases, I'm involved with, trying to, descale incarceration. I'm working with a number of organizations here. And so exactly, I take your point, Eric. It's that working within the community and drawing on, vestiges and rebadging it, relabeling it, public safety. I'm all for that. And this kind of, taking this, demilitarized and a whole, as I'd mentioned at the start, community policing, working with communities. Another example is the Carlton Connect initiative, where we have police, again, working with social workers, working with, this is Carlton. Carlton's a funny place in Victoria. It's inner city Melbourne. It's really gentrified. It's hip. It's Little Italy. It's restaurants. But there's a large scale of public housing and these kind of marginalized, disenfranchised people living in proximity to this wealth. And so it's working within that community to create real, viable social change. And that's the initiatives that we should be focusing on. So totally 100% support your positions there, Eric. And we're, it's similar things that we're approaching and trying to enact here in Australia.
And Ron, everything you're talking about is about developing a sense of community to which these people feel like they belong.
Yes. Yeah.
So that takes us back to. So I wanted to address something that had talked a little bit about healthcare and housing, and Rush had said if a million people are overweight and whatever other health risks, and a million other people are factually proven to be significantly less risky, how can it be fair for everyone to get free healthcare? Because it's not free. The money has to come from somewhere. Um, I I I don't
The
want
money does come from somewhere. The money comes from taxpayers, and it's that individualized approach of why should I pay for somebody that, or why should I pay? You want to know why? Because we're human beings and we live in a collective, and we should care for one another. We should care for people beyond our family. I mean, one thing punk rock taught me is that anyone can be family, and we should move beyond and think about the collective. Sorry,
No,
if you wanted to continue.
so glad you said that. I feel so passionately about that. We hear that so much here, Rush. The money's got to come from somewhere. You know what, though? Eric has talked about this so many times. We don't ever ask that question. We don't ever say, where's the money going to come from when we are funding the military to the tune of $780 billion.
Thank you.
We never ask where the money's coming from in those situations. You know, nobody's really making a big stink about the fact that $500 billion in funds that were supposed to be allocated to small businesses is now kind of missing with no real oversight as a result of the coronavirus. And the administration is going to just kind of say, there's no oversight.
Yeah.
We don't care about those things, but we don't want it to not be fair when it comes to, you know.
Yeah, I mean, a real just short example. I remember reading an article in the, I think it was in the Washington Post a couple of years ago about flying hot meals from Germany on a C-141 to troops in Afghanistan at something like to the tune of $4 million a day. You know, like, yeah. A monumental waste of money in my
well, I got
it would be good to see if they're spending $4 million a day on healthcare, $4 million a day on housing, or $4 million a day on, you know, I mean, you know, on that point of housing, I mean, you know, having spent 6 months in the Bay Area in 2018, man, it was expensive. You know, it was expensive. And, you know, people, you know, police officers, fire department, personnel, nurses, doctors, doctors maybe, nurses can't afford to live in San Francisco. They're living in, you know, 2 hours away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pete said, JL, he's talking to me, in my mind, you are creating a straw man discussion. The responsibility for a person's lifestyle is not the government in a capitalistic society. In a socialistic society, it is. You state that we need to provide healthcare, education, housing, etc. for free. We have never voted for socialism in our elections, so this is a large leap to take, and utilizing BLM as a basis to introduce Green New Deal, national health are not agreed upon rights in the USA. Pete, you misunderstood me. First of all, I did not say that we need to provide these things for free. I pointed out the folly of allowing these things to become so expensive that almost no one can afford them. There's a big difference there. Maybe they don't have to be free, but why have we allowed healthcare, education, higher education, and housing to skyrocket to where very few people can afford these things anymore? How is that an intelligent plan for a society?
Yeah.
Please
can
tell
I
me.
just jump in? Sorry, Eric. Oh, jump in.
This always drives me crazy because it isn't just like capitalism is allowed to exist. We do not have a free market. We are subsidizing corporations every single day. We are propping up our economy in ways. So it drives me crazy when we say like that healthcare isn't. I mean, it's about priorities. It's as simple as that. And this. We didn't agree on that. Well, we didn't agree on giving money to corporations either. And we didn't agree. Most of the time, we have no voice in whether or not we have military action in other countries. We don't get to decide that. And you put it to a vote, that $4 million going to meals, the American people would vote for American people to get those meals, bring those soldiers home and feed them here. You know, this. We are giving money in all kinds of ways. We don't just have a free market that we said, that's how capitalism is the system we have. We interfere every single day in that. and we don't do these other things. It's about priorities, and this voice, that is being raised right now is saying we want some other priorities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember ever being asked, and if I had been, I wouldn't have chosen to do it, to spend $1.9 trillion in Iraq. Nobody asked me about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would not have chosen to do that. Um, and Rush said that he said, you can do your ridiculous voice all you want. Rush, I'm sorry if I made a voice that sounded like I was making fun of you. You're making the case for everyone to not try to be healthy. Oh, come on. That's what I'm doing. I'm advocating that people not be healthy by saying,
Look,
that,
I think we're making an argument for, having a holistic, caring, and healthy society. And look, can I just clarify? Healthcare in Australia isn't free; it's scaled. If you're on a low income, if you're poor, so if you have a government pension card or healthcare card, we call it, your medical expenses are free. Your pharmaceuticals are very much, reduced. Example, I'm an academic, I'm on a full-time wage, so is my wife. We pay to go to the hospital, or to the doctor, sorry. But an example is, if I go to the doctor, I pay $48 to the practitioner, then I get a rebate of probably about $18. So in effect, I probably pay $22. So I do pay some money. It's not free, but it's very much, it's affordable. You're not paying $500, you're paying $28. And no one ever said free. And where the money comes from, I'm not sure if it was paid. It's tax dollars. Yeah, you pay higher tax because you want a healthy, caring society. Do you want to be riding on the bus next to a man whose leg is literally rotting off? I experienced this in Berkeley. It's horrifying. Why should a person be put in that position that it could possibly, affect public health? We should, it is a collective. I'm sorry, we live in a public. We live with people, and we should care about people. It's about society. It's not about, capitalism is, there's a guy, Martin Sprouse, a good old punk rock friend of mine. I don't know, people might be friends with him on Facebook. He runs an organization called Three Chord Politics. He's a graphic designer. He does these great memes that Tom Morello puts up behind his, when Tom Morello is playing concerts, he puts up, he had this great meme that, capitalism, I've got mine, fuck off, things like that. And that's really, where it's about. We need to think more broadly. Hey, I personally, I pay a lot of tax in Australia, but I've got a very comfortable house. I've got a mortgage. I send my daughter to a Catholic school, a private school. I'm comfortable. I don't mind some of my tax dollars going to somebody who's not as comfortable, to allow them, their daughter, the same opportunities as mine has. That, you were saying, John, earlier, that it sickens you, that you worry that, hey, your kids aren't going to go out and have to worry about getting shot by the police. It sickens me to know that, somebody my child's age, my 13-year-old daughter's age, can't afford, to eat, can't afford to get health care, can't afford. So I don't mind paying, higher tax dollars.
And we're already paying tax dollars for useless wars.
Yeah. Or for, the police to be equipped with, assault rifles and tanks and.
Yeah, I'd rather buy food for poor people with my tax money than bomb the country in the Middle East. Is that okay? And I really want to ask the folks that are out there, you guys, a couple of you have kind of misunderstood me, and I'd love to hear your response to what I actually said, because I never suggested anything about free healthcare. I'd like to know how you guys feel that it's a good idea to have those things be as costly as they are in our society, so that very few people can afford them. That's what I said.
Prohibitive. Yeah.
That's what I said. I didn't say we need free healthcare and free education. I said it's unwise to have them so incredibly preposterously expensive that no one can afford it. No one has responded to that. They've just chimed in with their own kind of version of what I'm saying about free healthcare, and I never said that. I'd like to hear you folks respond to that. How do you think that what we currently have is a good idea in terms of what people can afford for housing, for education, for healthcare, how is it a good idea to let those things expand price-wise by thousands of percentiles so no one can afford them? That's what I'd like to have somebody respond to, please.
John, they didn't expand just all by themselves either. These things are the price goes out of control because of the way that our government intervenes in favor of the top of the country. We don't, as you were saying before, we don't have just a free market. We have corporate capitalism, which causes these problems. We are making the decisions about giving money away, and we're just asking for a different set of priorities. I don't understand the and if it and this discussion about police also, I don't know, a month or 6 weeks ago, you and I had this conversation on this show about what is the purpose of government. To me,
thank you.
Well, most of the things that we're talking about, like healthcare, is for me personally way up, way up on the list. And what is the what is the purpose of the police? We have to ask ourselves these fundamental questions. And I know Pete's saying we didn't agree. It's not in the Constitution. We didn't agree, but we're citizens now. We can agree what we want it to be now, and then we go back and rewrite the laws. That's the way it always works.
Yeah, so maybe it's time to sit down and discuss, constitutional reform. I mean, just because it's in the Constitution, it's not something that can be, added to the amendments to the Constitution. They're difficult, they're hard, but these are discussions that need to be had. And I mean, I'd take, your points, Eric, to a T, and John. I mean, it's exactly, we didn't sign up for corporate welfare. That's precise. No one has a problem when there's corporate welfare. No one has a problem when a CEO earns $84 million a year. I have no idea what they do for that money. No one has a problem when, corporations are paying, 1% tax, or sometimes than that, 0.3% tax, because of a variety and range of loopholes that support, the capitalist system. No one seems to have a problem with that, but they have a problem with paying a little bit extra for healthcare. A wonderful film, a very interesting man, Robert Reich, his film Inequality summed it up so beautifully. And Robert Reich is in no way, shape, or form a communist or a socialist or any of these other, terms that people bandy about when they don't even understand the ideologies behind. I mean, what we might think about and say is maybe, yes, social democracy, social democrat, in a democratic system that has, a scaled, caring approach to government. And that point you make, Eric, what is the purpose of government? Yeah, the purpose of government is to govern and to provide infrastructure and support so that you can have a healthy and prosperous society. And you're not going to get that with these huge ranges of inequality. And this is, it used to be the gap between the rich and poor. I mean, we can see, over the last 20, 30 years, that neoliberal rollback of state responsibility and this increasing reliance on the so-called free market that, as we pointed out, isn't free. There's a number of corporate incentives and government incentives and bailouts and that corporate welfare. It's about that there is no longer a middle class. We talk about the shrinking middle class. I mean, we're in the US, it's becoming a society of the haves and the have-nots. And I mean, as I think you made the point earlier, John, is that people become disenfranchised, cut out of the system. They become angry, they become unruly. And that's, do you want that? They become desperate. No, we don't want that. We want real systemic change. And all of this is so much tied together. I mean, I'm kind of repeating points that you've touched on, but just to encapsulate it, it's about community. It's about collective. It's about we, the people, truly and honorably and honestly.
I think we got to the right place in this conversation because we got to economics. Pete said Thomas Sowell discusses these economics in a more conservative fashion. Do you have a solution to come up with the money to do this? If you took the $750 billion out of the military programs, it would not cover anywhere near the costs you are proposing. Pete, I have to ask you again, my friend, to do what? What am I proposing? I didn't propose anything. I put forth the idea that it is unwise to allow education, healthcare, and housing to become so incredibly unaffordable. I haven't proposed that we do anything about it.
Well, I mean, it's probably a discussion that needs to be had. That, well, yeah, okay, how do we fund it? How do we create systemic change? How do we address these issues? This is what we're talking about. No, do I have the answer in my hat or in my pocket? No. It's something that requires discussion, dialogue, change.
Yeah. And I'll say it again. I bring us back to this because that really believe that the reason that if there were just the problem, look, black people have been getting killed by police for a long time in this country. And aside from burning down a city once in a while and a few people paying lip service to it, we haven't done much about it. This thing's a groundswell that has the opportunity for real change. And I think it's because it is about that inequity. And everybody, a lot of Americans feel like they're part of that divide that you're talking about. They've fallen into that gap.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points that Robert Reich makes about an inequality for all is that, yeah, it's not just, it's become a lot of people now. There's a groundswell. It's not just, perhaps for a while, if it's, people of color that are poor, oh, we can turn a blind eye. But now it's a lot of people. It's a lot of society. A lot of people are struggling. Look, I know a lot of, my friends back in the US who can't afford healthcare, who can't afford, who get the flu. And, look, I had a friend die of pneumonia, something that's, unheard of because he couldn't afford to go to the hospital. That shouldn't happen.
No, that should never happen. Guys, I think we've been going for so long. I think we got this has been great, but I think we got to be out of time. Ron, dude, I got to tell you, man, I've loved having you here with me, brother. It's been great. Me and Eric loved having you on.
Oh, it's been excellent. Thanks for having me on board. And look, yeah. Thank you.
We got to do it again. Promise me.
Yeah, for sure, man. Would love to continue the conversations.
Right on, guys. This is our guest, Ron Baird. It's been a real pleasure having you, my friend. We'll see you real soon. Take care down there, down under.
Down under. Yep. Yeah. Take care, Eric. Take care, John.
Ron.
Good to see you, brother.
You take care.
Yeah. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're back. We'll wrap this up quickly. If you guys have any final comments you want to make, please, we want to hear from you. And thank you guys for being with us for this. This was a spirited discussion. Eric, I have a question for you. That unless you have something you really want to say.
I don't. I was just sort of exhaling, feeling like, but man, we've been going for a while, and like kind of trying to exhale. So go ahead. What do you got?
Do you feel, slavery was always about the economy, like we talked about. How are police departments connected to slavery historically?
Well, I mean, really, the start of policing was to run down runaway slaves. I mean, that's really how the form of, and it started in that way, chasing down runaway slaves. And I don't want to get too deep into this in this closing here, but like the statistics are really clear about the number of people that are stopped, the use of force, the incarceration rate, the rate of people that are killed. I mean, all of these numbers are disproportionately Black people, and some of that stuff is very intentional. If people out there haven't seen the movie 13th, it's about the 13th Amendment, and there's a chilling couple of statements from advisors to Nixon and to Reagan that couldn't be more racist and could not be more clear that they were specifically trying to paint Black people as criminals and incarcerate them. And they talked about when we start parading them, I mean, they're talking about incarceration and taking away their political power. It wasn't a long time ago. And in fact, when we're talking about these economics, you know, in the PPP loans that have just recently gone out, well, black businesses were the ones that got the short end of the stick again. So it continues, and it's a very, very deep problem, and it goes back since the beginning, and we still have not seen equality for all. And so we're gonna keep pushing that.
Right on. Well, guys, I'm gonna thank you, Eric. We're gonna wrap up now. I want to. I don't think I'm gonna go into too. I'm not gonna pound any points home. We've spent a lot of time tonight. So here's the way I see it. I'm just gonna share this with you guys, and I'll keep it quick tonight. But let me. I want to be able to share my screen here. This is kind of important, so bear with me, everybody. I've got like 5 different things going on. It's a bit of a challenge, but I will figure it out. And remember, guys, we're going to be back next week with Carl Parrish, who is a grassroots activist. So please join us. And then the week after that, we're going to get back on another story, because we've got some very interesting people that are going to be joining us to talk about what's going on with coronavirus, which is kind of spooky. So, guys, this is the way I see it. The way I see it, a lot of people are asking, why are all these people protesting? And I kind of want to say to those people, why aren't you? So I want to show you guys a picture. Well, let me get back to where I want to be here. I'm trying to share my screen, and I think I'm going to be able to do this. There we go. All right. There we go. So I want you guys to see this person right here. And see this woman sitting alone while people laugh at her and stare at her. This is the first woman to attend an all-white school, and this picture was taken in 1957. That's 63 years ago. The people laughing at her and staring at her are probably still alive. Do you guys watching tonight, do you know who Ruby, hold on a second, guys. Do you know, whoops, yeah, there we go. Sorry, I'm losing it here with my stuff. But do you guys know who I think it's, I can't see her name on here. We had, do you, there it is, sorry. Do you guys know who Ruby Bridges is? She was the first black child to attend an all-white school during the segregation battles in Louisiana. She's now 65 years old. So if you think that this is a dark echo out of our past, it's not from that long ago, guys. You ever been to a doctor and the doctor says, oh, you need to take these antibiotics for an infection? And they say, take all 10 days of the antibiotics, even if you feel better after the first couple of days, because we want to knock the infection out, right? To me, America's kind of like a patient who took antibiotics for racism and got 1 or 2 days into the treatment and went, you know what, I feel better. I'm just going to stop taking them. And it's festered. So this is such a challenging time in American history. But what I feel and what I want to say is that I think it's also a very hopeful time. We talked about this a little bit tonight. We can see it as a time of unprecedented unrest, but it's also a time of unprecedented possibility. Tony Robbins says, when you get disturbed, get excited. Why does he say that? Because when we get disturbed, we make the biggest changes in our lives. Well, folks, we are clearly disturbed, and this disturbance could be a causeway to a future where we could actually develop into a species that practices equality on a whole different level. I think we might be ready for it. I know my kids' generation is. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm choosing to be optimistic. So I just want to make a desperate plea to a few groups during this time. Here it goes. My first plea is to our police. I have family and friends in the police force. There are police watching this show. I know that you are primarily good people who want to serve your communities. And as our community heroes, we need to call upon your heroism now. We need you to change the way you do some things. We need you to hold your fellow officers accountable when they break the law. And you need it too. Your jobs are far more dangerous when the communities you serve don't trust you. From 2005 to 2011, there were 6,724 arrest cases against law enforcement in the country. That's over 1,000 law officers per year that were arrested. Imagine how many crimes went unreported or unpunished, because those statistics are scary too, of how many officers claim to have seen things that were illegal and didn't report it. Our police officers need to know that the thin blue line hurts them as much as anyone else. To quote a more famous talk show host than me, if you see something, say something, doesn't work if it doesn't apply to the people who are supposed to do something. And I also want to talk to American society. I think it's time we dismantle the childish mythology we cling to around the unquestionable sanctity of those in uniforms. We bestow upon our police and our military a sort of automatic heroism that has clearly become a faulty and distorted filter. Are there heroic police? Of course. Are most police heroic for showing up every day to do a tough job? Probably. Are all cops automatically heroes because they wear a badge? I'm sorry, absolutely not. Teaching children is a tough job too. I respect those who do it every day, but let me tell you something. As a parent, I can tell you, a lot of teachers suck at their job. And the same goes for the cops in the military. There is no brotherhood or community that one can join which automatically renders you heroic. There's only one standard by which we can continue to judge heroism, and that's the words and actions of the individual. We got to hold ourselves to those standards, and we have to hold those who are taking these tough jobs to those same standards as well. Police, we trust you to carry a gun in public. We trust you to use force when necessary. We trust you to serve and protect us, but it's got to be all of us. That's when you become heroic. Let's stop worshiping costumes and pay attention to the actions of the men and women who wear them. Now look what happened with priests, right? My plea to the protesters, all those out there protesting, stay the course. If anyone among you is committing crimes, you have to stop them. We have to take responsibility for the movement. You have to denounce any message that promotes hate or violence. You're taking this further than anyone thought it could go because you've won hearts and minds around the world. You won't keep those hearts and minds in our corner if we descend into violence or let fringe groups make it appear that we are. My next plea, and this one's near and dear to my heart, to the corporate brands, politicians, media pundits, and all the image conscious who are desperately pandering to minorities as a PR stunt, stay out of this, please. We got it. We don't need your tone-deaf idiocy muddying the waters of what is an actual movement born out of the concern for people to simply have an equal shot at life. So if you're joining the fight to gain fans or likes or market share by appearing overly woke, please go away. This week, Quaker Oats, a subsidiary of PepsiCo, announced they will change their Aunt Jemima brand and image because it promotes racism. My God, how brave of you, Pepsi. It's only taken you 45 years or so. Please, do you think people are out in the streets because of Aunt Jemima? Hey, Pepsi, you want to really help? Diabetes and heart disease are rampant in the black communities in the United States. They are also the most dangerous comorbidities for those who contract coronavirus, which has ravaged black communities. You know where a lot of these folks develop these diseases? By ingesting your shitty products. So rather than your bold move of removing the image of an old black woman from your oatmeal boxes, how about pledging to get rid of some of the sugars and fillers in your food that make so many people sick? Oh, and since you're in this for the people, don't raise your prices. Just raise the quality of the food you produce. No? That's what I thought. Quaker Oats' publicity stunt, like so many others I've seen out there these past few weeks, is the equivalent of donating a bag of old clothes that you're going to throw out anyway to Goodwill, then posting a selfie of you with the Goodwill truck driver who picked them up with the caption, "So important to be in contribution." Ugh. And lastly, to those opposed to the protest, those who want to respond, all lives matter, those who feel accused by this movement rather than ready to listen, I think I understand where you're coming from. And you are, of course, free to have your own perspective on these protests. Your outrage is not historically uncommon. Revolts and uprisings are often feared as dangerous subversions during the time of the revolt. The nobility of many a movement was bestowed upon it by history, the people looking back on it rather than those living through it. And you know what they say about hindsight? I mean, look at Martin Luther King. We name streets and holidays after him now. But in his time, he was considered dangerous enough by the establishment that, well, somebody shot him. Please, I want to read you some names. And if you have children, get rid of them. Have them leave the room. This is not very nice. It's not pretty. I don't mean to get rid of them, of course, but I mean ask the kids to cover their ears to leave the room. Akai Gurley, Tanisha Anderson, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Botham Jean, Stephon Clark, Tatiana Jefferson, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Oscar Grant, Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor. These are just some of the names of black people killed by police in the last 10 years, unarmed, under circumstances questionable enough to yield legal judgments, usually civil judgments, with the officers involved not being held accountable. I could have kept going because there are more than a few more names on this list, but these should be enough. Look, Breonna Taylor, she was sleeping in her bed. Someone kicked her door in and shot her and her boyfriend. Imagine that happening to you or someone you care about. Tamir Rice was a teenager playing with a toy gun in his backyard when police shot and killed him within seconds of arriving on the scene. Remember Ahmaud Arbery? He was jogging when two men chased him down and shot and killed him because they suspected him of a crime. They suspected him. And one of them, a former law enforcement officer, stood over his dead body and said, "Effing N-word." For 2 months, no charges were brought against those men. It took these protests to make something happen. So I'm going to say to you, if you're more concerned about broken windows, graffiti, and the Antifa boogeyman, removed Civil War statues, and TVs stolen from Target, than you are about what happened to these people, I'm going to beg you to re-examine what you define as human decency. Not all African American people are innocent victims. The national discussion that needs to take place is difficult and nuanced. But black people in the USA have a valid concern about the deadly violence they and their children too often face at the hands of police. They are asking in a loud, angry voice for their countrymen, us, to hear their grievances. What kind of brothers and sisters are we if we don't have the strength and compassion to listen? That's our show tonight. Thank you all so much for being here. Love you guys for participating. Eric and I will be back next week with Carl Parrish. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe. I want to thank Ron once again. And remember, everybody, next week we'll be on our Common Ground page. I'll send out another reminder, but this is the last time I'm going to post from my page. We're going to move to the Common Ground page where we belong. So thanks, everybody, once again. I'll send out a notification about that. Thanks for being here. Love you guys.
Thanks, everyone.